My name is Harold, and at 73, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at a man. 4 decades as a mechanic, raising 3 kids with my late wife Martha, watching grandchildren grow up in the shadow of my small garage on the outskirts of Millerville, Kansas. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what Old Blue and I would uncover in that crumbling stone mansion we bought for a song. People laughed when I drove up to the county auction that October morning, Blue's grizzled muzzle hanging out the passenger window of my '98 Silverado. The auctioneer was rattling off lot numbers for abandoned properties, tax liens, foreclosures, the usual parade of broken dreams that small-town America knows too well. When he got to the Weatherby place, that hulking stone fortress built in 1974 by some oil money eccentric, the crowd practically snickered. 3 stories of crumbling fieldstone, boarded windows, a roof that laked like a sieve, sitting on 12 acres of overgrown pasture. The minimum bid was $8,000, and nobody seemed interested in touching it. Blue shifted restlessly beside me, his ears pricked forward in that way that meant he sensed something the rest of us couldn't. I'd learned to trust that dog's instincts over the 30 years we'd been partners. He was just a pup when I found him abandoned at the truck stop, barely weaned and shivering in a cardboard box. Now his muzzle was gray as mine, but his nose was still sharp as a tack. When he whined low in his throat and pressed his paws against the dashboard, staring at that stone mansion like it held secrets, I raised my paddle. 8,500, 9,000, nobody else bid. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed across the autumn air, and suddenly I owned a piece of Kansas history that everyone else seemed eager to forget. My grandson Tyler, fresh out of college with his business degree, shook his head when I told him, "Grandpa, that place is a money pit. You could have bought a nice little retirement condo for that price." But something in Blue's behavior that day told me we'd made the right choice, even if I couldn't explain why. Growing up during the tail end of the Great Depression shaped everything I understood about value and waste. My father ran a blacksmith shop when cars were still competing with horses on Main Street, and he taught me that every piece of metal, every forgotten tool, every scrap of leather had potential if you looked at it right. "Harold," he'd say, hammering out horseshoes on the anvil that still sits in my garage, "most folks throw away their fortunes because they can't see past the rust." My mother, God rest her soul, could stretch a dollar until it screamed, turning flour sacks into Sunday dresses and bacon grease into enough meals to feed us through the lean months. That childhood trained me to see possibility where others saw problems. When Martha and I started our family in the '70s, I bought my first garage from old Pete Morrison for $300 and a promise to fix his combine. It was nothing but a concrete slab, 4 walls, and a leaky roof, but I saw a life there. 38 years later, when I finally sold the business to my nephew, it was a thriving operation with 6 bays and a reputation that stretched 3 counties in every direction. But success came from the same principle my father taught me: look past the surface, find the value hidden underneath. Blue understood this philosophy better than most humans. He had an eye for finding dropped bolts in tall grass, lost sockets in the dark corners of the shop, and once memorably, a customer's wedding ring that had fallen into a storm drain. More importantly, he could sense the character of people before they opened their mouths. He'd growl low and steady at men who'd try to shortchange me on a repair bill, but he'd rest his chin on the lap of a young mother counting quarters to pay for a tire patch. That dog had a moral compass that pointed truer than any I'd known. The mansion sat on what used to be the Weatherby Ranch, 12 miles east of town where the prairie starts to roll into gentle hills. Marcus Weatherby made his fortune in the oil boom of the early '70s, drilling wells that produced black gold until the bus came calling. The locals remembered him as an eccentric recluse who built his stone castle and lived there alone until his death in 1987. Since then, the property had passed through a series of distant relatives, none of whom wanted to invest in maintaining the place. By the time I bought it, the stone walls were the only thing keeping the structure from complete collapse. My first visit to the property with Blue revealed the scope of the challenge I'd taken on. The front door, solid oak beneath layers of peeling paint, groaned open on hinges that hadn't seen oil in decades. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken windows, and every footstep echoed. Like thunder, the main floor featured a massive living room with a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole hog, a kitchen frozen in 1974 avocado green, and a dining room with a table built from what looked like a single enormous oak tree. But it was the basement that caught Blue's attention. We'd barely descended the creaking wooden stairs when he started acting strange, not scared, but intensely focused. His nose worked overtime, following some scent trail that led him to the far corner where the stone foundation met a newer-looking concrete wall. He pawed at the junction, whining softly, then looked back at me with those intelligent brown eyes that had guided me through countless repairs over the years. The concrete work was obviously amateur, maybe 10 years old based on the color and texture. Someone had sealed off what looked like it might have been a root cellar or storage area, but they'd done it in a hurry. The mortar joints were uneven, and there were gaps where mice had chewed through the expanding foam used to fill cracks. Blue kept returning to one particular spot, pressing his nose against a section where the concrete seemed thinner. When I tapped it with a hammer, it sounded hollow underneath. My practical side told me to leave well enough alone. I had plenty of work ahead just making the main house livable, and whatever was behind that wall had been sealed for a reason. But Blue's persistence nagged at me. That dog had never steered me wrong in 3 decades, and his behavior suggested something significant lay hidden behind the amateur concrete job. Still, I wasn't about to start demolishing walls without understanding what I might find. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Every morning, Blue and I would drive out to the mansion with a thermos of coffee and whatever tools the day's project required. I started with the roof, patching holes and replacing missing shingles, then moved on to the electrical system that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. Blue would follow me around for the first hour, then inevitably disappear to the basement where I'd find him later, still fixated on that concrete wall. Local reaction to my purchase ranged from polite concern to outright mockery. At the hardware store, Earl Jenkins shook his head every time I came in for supplies. "Harold, that place has been nothing but trouble for every owner since Weatherby died. You sure you know what you're getting into?" The coffee shop crowd was less diplomatic. I'd overhear snippets of conversation about old Harold losing his marbles and throwing good money after bad on that stone tomb. But there were others who offered encouragement. Mrs. Patterson, who taught school for 40 years and never married, stopped by one afternoon with a plate of cookies and stories about the Weatherby place in its heyday. Marcus was peculiar, but he wasn't crazy, she told me, sitting in the kitchen while Blue dozed at her feet. He was secretive, especially toward the end, always talking about preserving things for the future, making sure the right people would find what he left behind. Of course, nobody knew what that meant at the time. Her words stuck with me as I continued the restoration work. Marcus Weatherby had been an engineer before the oil business made him rich, and everything about the house showed meticulous planning. The stone walls were perfectly plumb, the foundation was over-engineered for the weight it carried, and even the rusted plumbing showed signs of careful design. This wasn't a man who did anything haphazardly, which made the sloppy concrete work in the basement even more mysterious. 3 months into the project, Blue's behavior intensified. He'd started spending entire days in the basement, barely coming up for food and water. Sometimes I'd find him sleeping pressed against the concrete wall, as if he could absorb whatever secrets it held through osmosis. His persistence finally wore down my resistance to the inevitable. If I was going to live in this house, I needed to know what was behind that wall, even if it turned out to be nothing more than an old root cellar filled with empty mason jars. The demolition revealed my first clue that this was more than simple storage. Behind the amateur concrete lay a steel door, industrial grade, with a combination lock that looked military surplus. The door frame was set perfectly into the original stone foundation, suggesting it had been installed when the house was built, not added later. Someone had gone to considerable expense and effort to seal this room, then tried to make it look like amateur work to throw off casual observers. Blue was practically vibrating with excitement as I examined the lock mechanism. It was a mechanical combination lock, the kind used on safes and security doors, with 4 number wheels that would need to be set in the correct sequence. Without the combination, opening it would require either professional safe cracking equipment or enough explosives to bring down half the basement. Neither option appealed to me, but Blue's insistence that something important lay beyond that door had become impossible to ignore. That's when I remembered Mrs. Patterson's stories about Marcus Weatherby's obsession with preservation and his cryptic comments about the right people finding what he'd left behind. If Weatherby had built this vault as part of his original construction, maybe he'd left clues somewhere in the house about how to access it. The man was an engineer. He'd think systematically about security and access. I spent the next week searching every room, looking for anything that might contain a 4-digit combination. Birth dates, addresses, phone numbers, oil well coordinates. I tried everything I could find in the scattered papers and personal effects left behind by decades of neglect. Nothing worked. The lock mechanism remained stubbornly closed, and my frustration grew with each failed attempt. Blue seemed to sense my discouragement, pressing closer during the long evenings when I'd sit staring at that steel door, wondering if I was chasing ghosts. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tyler, my grandson with the business degree and skeptical attitude toward the mansion project, stopped by one Saturday morning with coffee and donuts. He found me in the basement, slumped in a folding chair in front of the steel door, while Blue maintained his usual vigil against the concrete wall. "You look like you're planning to stare that thing open," Tyler said, settling down beside me with his coffee. I explained about the lock, the failed combinations, and my growing suspicion that Marcus Weatherby had left some kind of puzzle for future discoverers. Tyler listened without his usual commentary about wasted money and impractical projects, which surprised me. You know, Grandpa, when I was researching the property records for insurance purposes, I noticed something odd about the construction date. The building permit was filed in February 1974, but there's a separate permit for specialized basement installations dated exactly 1 year later. Whatever's behind that door was important enough for Weatherby to add it after the main construction was complete. That information sent me back to the county courthouse, where dusty records revealed more details about Marcus Weatherby's final years. The specialized basement permit had been filed just months before oil prices collapsed, wiping out fortunes across Kansas and Texas. Weatherby's drilling operation had shut down in late 1975, but he'd continued living in the stone mansion until his death 12 years later, apparently supported by investments and savings that nobody knew much about. The real revelation came from Weatherby's obituary, buried in the February 1987 archives of the Millerville Gazette. According to the brief death notice, Marcus Weatherby had been born on February 15, 1920, and had served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He'd never married, had no children, and his closest living relative at the time of death was a nephew in California who'd inherited the property and promptly forgotten about it. But it was the date of the specialized basement permit that caught my attention, February 15, 1975, exactly 55 years after Weatherby's birth and exactly on his 55th birthday. An engineer's mind would find that symmetry appealing, and it seemed like exactly the kind of detail someone might use as a memorable combination. Back in the basement that afternoon, with Blue watching intently, I set the lock to 0215. The mechanism clicked open with a sound like money falling into a collection plate. Beyond the steel door lay a room that took my breath away. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet by 12, but every square inch had been utilized with the precision of a master craftsman. The walls were lined with industrial shelving units, each shelf carefully labeled and containing items that represented a lifetime of collecting. Not hoarding, collecting, with the systematic approach of someone who understood the value of preservation. Blue padded into the room ahead of me, his tail wagging for the first time in weeks. Whatever scent he'd been tracking was strongest here, in this carefully maintained time capsule that had been waiting 48 years for someone to discover it. The air smelled of oil and leather and something else, that particular mustiness of old papers and well-preserved wood. The first thing that caught my attention was a workbench along the far wall, equipped with precision tools that any mechanic would envy. Micrometers, calipers, bore gauges, and measuring instruments I'd only seen in automotive trade magazines. But these weren't random purchases. Each tool was arranged with military precision and showed signs of regular maintenance even after decades of storage. Marcus Weatherby might have been a recluse, but he'd been a craftsman first. The shelving units revealed the true scope of his preservation project. One section contained automotive parts, rare components for classic cars, still in their original packaging or carefully wrapped in old paper. Another held documents in fireproof filing cabinets, organized by date and subject with the thoroughness that only a former military engineer could achieve. A third section housed what looked like mechanical drawings and blueprints, rolled in protective tubes and labeled with codes I didn't immediately recognize. But it was the corner display case that made my hands shake as I reached for the light switch. Inside, arranged on custom-built stands, sat the most complete collection of early automotive memorabilia I'd ever seen outside a museum. Not reproductions or replicas, but original items that represented the birth of American automotive culture. A carburetor from a 1908 Ford Model T, spark plugs from a 1932 Duesenberg. A complete ignition system from a 1941 Willys that looked like it had been removed yesterday and carefully preserved ever since. Each item bore a small placard with details written in precise engineering script, date of manufacture, original vehicle application, historical significance, and estimated value as of 1975. The numbers on those placards made me sit down hard on a wooden stool that Weatherby had positioned perfectly for viewing his collection. Even using 48-year-old valuations, the items in this room represented a fortune. Using current collector prices for authenticated automotive antiques, I was looking at enough money to buy and restore a dozen stone mansions. Blue had found his own treasure in the corner where a small pile of carefully preserved leather work gloves lay beside a dog bed that looked suspiciously similar to his favorite spot in my garage. Next to the bed sat a metal bowl, still shiny despite the decades, with partner engraved on the side in the same precise script as the placards. Marcus Weatherby had owned a dog, and he'd planned for that dog to be comfortable during long hours in this hidden workshop. The filing cabinets contained the story behind the collection. Weatherby's records showed he'd begun acquiring automotive antiques in the late 1960s, using his oil wealth to purchase items directly from manufacturers, salvage yards, and the families of automotive pioneers. His correspondence files revealed relationships with collectors, museum curators, and automotive historians across the country. This wasn't the impulse buying of a rich man with too much money. It was the systematic preservation effort of someone who understood he was witnessing the end of an era. One particular file folder, labeled For Future Stewards, contained a letter addressed simply to whoever finds this room. Weatherby's handwriting was immediately recognizable from the thousands of placards and inventory sheets throughout the collection. The letter, dated December 1986, just 2 months before his death, explained his motivation for creating the vault. The oil boom made me wealthy, but it also showed me how quickly fortunes can disappear when the world changes. I've spent the last 15 years gathering and preserving items that represent American ingenuity and craftsmanship from the early automotive age. These pieces tell the story of how we transformed from a horse-powered society to the mobile culture that defines us today. They deserve to be preserved by someone who understands their value, not sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder. The letter continued with detailed instructions for cataloging and maintaining the collection, including contacts for authentication experts and auction houses specializing in automotive antiques. But the final paragraph hit me like a punch to the gut. I've arranged for this property to eventually pass to someone who will appreciate what I've preserved here. The legal mechanisms are in place, but they may take decades to work through the system. Whoever finds this room has proven they're willing to see past surface appearances to recognize true value. That quality suggests they're the right person to decide this collection's future. At the bottom of the filing cabinet, I found the documents that explained everything. Marcus Weatherby had established a trust in 1985, with instructions that if the property remained abandoned or underutilized for more than 30 years, it would be sold at public auction with all contents included. The trust documents, prepared by a law firm in Kansas City, specified that the sale would include all buildings, improvements, and contents, whether visible or concealed, on the property. Every item in the hidden vault legally belonged to whoever bought the property at auction. They belonged to me. The implications of that discovery sent me into a week of sleepless nights and careful research. I drove to Kansas City to meet with the law firm that had managed Weatherby's trust, carrying blue and a folder full of questions that had been building since I'd first opened that steel door. The attorney who'd handled the original trust had retired, but his successor was familiar with the unusual arrangement Weatherby had created. Mr. Weatherby was very specific about his intentions, she explained, reviewing the trust documents in her downtown office. He wanted to ensure his collection would go to someone who valued preservation over profit, but he couldn't predict who that might be or when it might happen. The public auction mechanism was designed to attract someone willing to take on a challenging restoration project, exactly the kind of person he thought would appreciate what he'd preserved. The authentication process took another month, but every item in the collection proved to be exactly what Weatherby's records claimed. The 1908 Model T carburetor alone was worth more than I'd paid for the entire property. The Duesenberg parts, the Willys ignition system, and dozens of other components represented the kind of automotive history that major museums competed to acquire. Conservative estimates put the total collection value at just over $2 million. But the money, staggering as it was, wasn't what kept me awake at night. It was the responsibility. Marcus Weatherby had spent 15 years and a considerable fortune assembling this collection because he believed automotive history deserved preservation. Now that responsibility had passed to me, along with the question of what to do with it. Blue seemed to understand the weight of the decision. He'd taken to spending his days in the vault, lying on Marcus Weatherby's old dog bed while I cataloged items and researched their provenance. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with that intelligent expression that suggested he knew exactly what I was thinking about. The money could set up my grandchildren for life, but selling the collection would scatter it to individual buyers who might not understand or preserve its historical significance. The answer came from an unexpected conversation with my youngest granddaughter, Emma, who was studying museum science at the University of Kansas. She'd driven out to see the mansion restoration one weekend, expecting to humor her grandfather's latest project. Instead, she found herself documenting automotive artifacts that belonged in the Smithsonian. "Grandpa, do you realize what you have here?" she asked, photographing the Duesenberg components with the systematic approach she'd learned in her museum courses. "This isn't just a collection, it's a complete narrative of American automotive development. Museums would kill for this kind of comprehensive historical documentation." Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own excitement decades earlier when I'd first learned to rebuild engines and understand the mechanical poetry of internal combustion. The collection wasn't just valuable, it was educational, inspiring, a bridge between the pioneering days of American automotive culture and the digital age my grandchildren were inheriting. That's when the solution became clear. Instead of selling individual pieces or donating the entire collection to a distant museum, I could create something that honored both Marcus Weatherby's preservation instincts and my own roots in the community. The stone mansion, once restored, could house a private museum showcasing the collection while providing educational programs for local schools and automotive enthusiasts. The plan required more money than I had available, but the collection itself provided the answer. A carefully selected portion of the duplicates and less historically significant items could be sold to fund the restoration and museum development, while the core collection remained intact for public education and enjoyment. Emma's museum contacts helped identify which pieces could be ethically sold without compromising the collection's narrative integrity. Tyler, my initially skeptical grandson, threw himself into developing the business plan for the museum project. His market research revealed tremendous demand for hands-on automotive history experiences, particularly among the classic car enthusiast community that stretched across the Midwest. The Weatherby Automotive Heritage Museum, as we decided to call it, could become a destination that honored both the collection's history and its educational mission. The restoration work took another 18 months, funded partly by the sale of carefully selected collection pieces and partly by donations from automotive enthusiasts who learned about the project through specialized publications and car shows. Blue supervised every phase of the construction, offering his approval or concern about contractors, delivery schedules, and the installation of climate control systems designed to preserve delicate automotive artifacts. The museum opened on February 15, 2024, exact. Live 49 years after Marcus Weatherby had installed his vault and begun assembling the collection that would change my life. The opening ceremony drew automotive historians, collectors, and enthusiasts from across the country, along with most of Millerville and the surrounding communities that had once mocked my purchase of a worthless stone mansion. But the moment that meant the most came later that evening, after the crowds had gone home and the museum had settled into quiet. Blue and I walked through the exhibits one final time, checking that everything was secure for the night. In the corner of the main gallery, I'd installed a small display case containing Marcus Weatherby's original letter and the story of how the collection had been discovered. Next to it sat the metal bowl marked Partner, with a placard explaining how one dog's persistence had led to uncovering this treasure trove of automotive history. Blue settled down on his favorite rug in front of the display, his grizzled muzzle resting on his paws as he surveyed the museum that his instincts had made possible. The skeptics who'd laughed at an old mechanic and his dog buying a crumbling mansion had witnessed something they hadn't expected, the power of looking past surface appearances to find the value hidden underneath. The museum has welcomed thousands of visitors in the months since opening, from school groups learning about American innovation to serious collectors researching automotive history. Every tour group hears the story of how the collection was discovered, and many leave with a new appreciation for the importance of preservation and the unexpected places where history hides. The financial security the project brought my family was gratifying, but the real reward has been watching young people discover the same excitement about mechanical craftsmanship that had shaped my own life. Emma now serves as the museum's education director, developing programs that connect automotive history to broader themes of American innovation and perseverance. Tyler manages the business operations with the same attention to detail his great-grandfather would have appreciated. As for Blue and me, we found our purpose in these later years. Every morning we drive out to the museum together, greeting visitors who come to see what a 1970s oil millionaire thought was worth preserving for the future. Blue, now pushing 14, moves a little slower than he used to, but his nose is still sharp enough to detect when someone truly appreciates what they're seeing versus those who are just passing through. The mansion that everyone else saw as a burden has become a bridge between past and future, a place where the ingenuity of American automotive pioneers inspires new generations of makers and thinkers. Marcus Weatherby's hidden vault has yielded its secrets, but more importantly, it's fulfilled his vision of preservation and education that he never lived to see implemented. Sometimes, late in the evening when the museum is closed and Blue and I are doing our final security walk, I think about the chain of coincidences that led us here. A county auction nobody else wanted to attend, a dog's unexplained fixation on a concrete wall, an engineer's systematic approach to preservation, and his faith that the right person would eventually find what he'd hidden. The people who mocked us for buying that stone mansion couldn't see what Blue's instincts had detected from the beginning, that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are hidden behind the most unpromising exteriors. They saw a crumbling building that would drain money and time. We found a treasure that had been waiting 48 years for someone willing to look beyond the surface. That lesson extends far beyond automotive collecting or property restoration. In a world that increasingly values appearance over substance and quick profits over long-term preservation, Marcus Weatherby's vault reminds us that true value often lies hidden, waiting for someone with the patience and persistence to uncover it. Blue and I were fortunate enough to be that someone, but I suspect there are hidden treasures all around us, waiting for people willing to trust their instincts and look past the obvious. The Weatherby Automotive Heritage Museum stands as proof that one person's vision, properly preserved and thoughtfully presented, can inspire and educate countless others. But it also represents something more personal, the vindication that comes from trusting your instincts even when everyone else thinks you're making a mistake. Blue knew there was something special about that stone mansion from the moment we first saw it. His persistence and my willingness to listen to his guidance led us to a discovery that changed not just our lives, but created something of lasting value for our entire community. Have you ever had a moment when your instincts told you to pursue something that everyone else thought was foolish? Sometimes the most important discoveries come from being willing to look where others won't, to trust what others dismiss, and to invest time and effort in things that don't immediately show their value. I'd love to hear about your own experiences with hidden treasures, unexpected discoveries, or times when persistence revealed something remarkable that had been waiting for the right person to find it.